The fluorescent lights of Rosie's diner buzzed with that particular frequency that meant they'd need replacing soon, but nobody was going to replace them because nobody had the budget for that kind of thing. Emma Chen wiped down the same section of counter for the third time that morning, her hands moving in the mechanical pattern she'd developed over 2 years of working the breakfast shift. She was 24 years old, and felt like she'd been standing behind this counter for a lifetime. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, a combination that had permanently embedded itself into her uniform no matter how many times she washed it. Outside the windows, the small town of Millbrook was just beginning to wake up, the street lights still on even though the sun was starting to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emma had opened the diner at 5:30, just like she did every morning except Sundays, and now at 6:15 she was waiting for the usual crowd of construction workers and truck drivers who would file in demanding coffee and eggs before they started their days. She'd learned their orders by heart, rarely needing to write anything down anymore, and they barely looked at her when they spoke, just grunted their requests while scrolling through their phones. That was fine with Emma, she preferred it that way, the less attention on her the better. She'd always been the quiet one, the girl who sat in the back of the classroom and hoped the teacher wouldn't call on her, the teenager who ate lunch in the library to avoid the cafeteria chaos, the woman who still felt her heart race when she had to make small talk with strangers. Her therapist had called it social anxiety, but Emma just thought of it as who she was. Some people were loud and confident, she was not. The bell above the door chimed and Frank Morrison walked in, right on schedule, work boots clumping against the linoleum floor. Emma already had his coffee poured, black with 2 sugars, and she set it at his usual spot at the counter without a word. He nodded at her, which was the extent of their daily interaction, and pulled out his phone. 3 more regulars followed in the next 10 minutes, and Emma moved through the motions of taking orders, calling them back to Jose in the kitchen, refilling coffee cups, delivering plates of eggs and hash browns. Her anxiety was always lower during the morning routine, because she knew exactly what to expect, exactly what everyone would want, exactly how the next 2 hours would unfold. It was when something unexpected happened that her chest would tighten and her hands would start to shake. She was pouring coffee for table 4 when the bell chimed again, and she glanced up out of habit to see who was coming in. The woman who walked through the door was unlike anyone Emma had ever seen in Rosie's diner. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, wearing a coat that looked like it cost more than Emma made in 3 months. Pearl earrings caught the morning light as she moved, and her leather handbag had that unmistakable quality of something real and expensive. She stood just inside the doorway, looking around the diner with an expression that seemed both lost and determined, and Emma felt her anxiety spike immediately, because this woman was clearly not a regular, and Emma had no script for how to handle her. The woman's eyes landed on Emma and she walked toward the counter, but there was something hesitant in her movements, something uncertain. When she reached the counter, she opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, and Emma saw her hand move to her ear in a gesture that suddenly made everything clear. The woman was trying to communicate something, pointing to her ear, and then making a series of hand movements that Emma didn't understand at first. Then the woman pulled out a small notepad from her purse, and wrote in careful cursive handwriting, "I am deaf. May I please have a table?" Emma felt her heart do something strange in her chest, a mixture of compassion and recognition, because here was someone else who struggled with communication, someone else who felt like an outsider in everyday situations. Without thinking, without the usual anxiety that paralyzed her when faced with something unexpected, Emma smiled and nodded. She gestured toward the best booth in the diner, the one by the window with the least cracked vinyl, and led the woman over. The elderly woman's face transformed with relief and gratitude as she slid into the booth, setting her purse beside her. Emma grabbed a menu and set it down, but then she did something she'd never done before in 2 years of working at Rosie's. She pulled out her phone and quickly typed into the Notes app, holding it up for the woman to read. "My name is Emma. I will help you. Take your time with the menu." The woman's eyes filled with tears and she reached out to briefly touch Emma's hand, a gesture that made Emma's chest tighten, but not with anxiety this time, with something warmer and unfamiliar. The woman picked up the menu and began studying it while Emma went back to the counter to check on her other tables, but her mind was racing. She'd heard about sign language, of course, seen it on television, but she'd never actually tried to learn it. As she refilled coffee and delivered plates of pancakes, she kept glancing back at the elderly woman, watching her sit there with such dignity despite being in a place where she couldn't communicate the way most people did. When Emma returned to take the woman's order, she brought her phone already open to the Notes app. The woman pointed to the menu items she wanted: scrambled eggs and wheat toast with tea, and Emma typed it in and showed her to confirm. The woman nodded, and then began typing on her own phone, turning it around to show Emma. "Thank you for being so kind. Most places, people get impatient with me." Emma felt something crack open in her chest reading those words. She quickly typed back, "I understand what it's like to feel different. I'm glad you came in today." She sent the order to the kitchen and kept moving through her other tables, but every few minutes she found herself looking back at the booth where the elderly woman sat, sipping her tea and gazing out the window. There was something about her posture, about the way she held herself, that spoke of a life lived with grace despite challenges. When Emma brought the food, the woman gestured for her to sit down, just for a moment, and Emma surprised herself by sliding into the opposite side of the booth for just 30 seconds. The woman was already typing. "I'm Margaret. I've been deaf since I was 12. Illness took my hearing. Most days I do fine, but sometimes I just want to go somewhere normal, eat somewhere normal." Emma typed back quickly, her thumbs flying across the screen in a way they never did when she was texting friends, because she had so few friends to text. "You are normal. Different isn't wrong. I have anxiety and sometimes I can't even speak to people face to face without feeling like I'm drowning." She hesitated before hitting send, surprised at her own honesty with a stranger, but something about Margaret made her feel safe. Margaret read the message and her face softened with understanding. She typed, "Then we both know what it's like to be invisible in a room full of people." Emma nodded, feeling tears prick at her eyes, and had to stand up quickly because Frank was holding up his empty coffee cup. But something had shifted in the diner that morning. As Emma went through the rest of her shift, refilling and serving and wiping down tables, she kept returning to Margaret's booth, and each time they exchanged a few typed messages. Margaret told her about her late husband, about her garden, about the book club she attended where everyone had learned some basic sign language just for her. Emma told her about her dreams of maybe going back to school someday, about how she'd dropped out of community college because sitting in a classroom full of people made her feel like she was suffocating, about how she knew she should want more from life but didn't know how to reach for it. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 10:30, and Emma glanced up from where she was tallying receipts at the register. The man who walked in made everyone in the diner turn and stare, not just because he was movie star handsome with dark hair touched with distinguished grey at the temples, but because everything about him screamed money and power, and a world far removed from Rosie's diner. His suit probably cost more than Emma's car, and his shoes were the kind of leather that came from Italian craftsmen, whose names she'd never heard. But it wasn't his appearance that made Emma freeze in place. It was the expression on his face. He looked frantic, desperate, his eyes scanning the diner with barely contained panic until they landed on Margaret's booth. Then his entire body seemed to collapse with relief. He said something, his voice carrying across the diner, "Mom, thank God," and started toward the booth. But Margaret wasn't looking at him. She was focused on her tea, unaware of his arrival, and Emma watched the man's face shift through several emotions before he seemed to understand. He slowed his approach, and when he reached the booth, he gently placed his hand on the table where Margaret could see it. She looked up, and her face transformed with joy and surprise. She stood, and the man wrapped her in a hug that looked like it was holding together all the fear he'd been carrying. Emma turned away to give them privacy, but she couldn't help watching from the corner of her eye as they sat down together, the man immediately pulling out his phone to type messages to his mother. They communicated back and forth with the ease of people who'd been doing this for years, but Emma could see tension in the man's shoulders, could see him typing something long and Margaret responding with obvious apology. After a few minutes the man stood and walked over to the counter where Emma was pretending to organize straws. Up close he was even more striking, with eyes the color of steel, and a jawline that belonged on magazine covers, and Emma felt her anxiety slam into her like a wave. She gripped the edge of the counter, trying to remember how to breathe normally. The man seemed to notice her distress because his expression immediately softened. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, the kind of voice used to putting people at ease. I'm looking for whoever helped my mother this morning. She wandered away from her assisted living facility and we've been searching for 3 hours. I've been losing my mind. Emma forced herself to look up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. That was me. I just treated her like anyone else. The man stared at her for a long moment, and Emma wanted to disappear under the intensity of his gaze. Then he did something unexpected. His eyes filled with tears, and he had to clear his throat before speaking. You have no idea what that means. Most people, they either ignore her or treat her like she's broken. They get frustrated when they can't communicate easily. They make her feel invisible. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I'm David Hartford. Margaret Hartford is my mother. Emma nodded, not recognizing the name but seeing the weight of relief and gratitude in his expression. David continued, she was diagnosed with early-stage dementia 6 months ago. Most days she's fine, sharp as ever, but sometimes she gets confused or forgetful. This morning she walked out of her facility during a shift change, and nobody noticed for 2 hours. I've had half the police department looking for her. He ran a hand through his hair, disheveling the perfect styling. When I finally tracked her phone here, I thought, I was terrified of what I'd find, that she's sitting there having breakfast like everything's normal, because someone actually took the time to communicate with her the way she needs. Emma didn't know what to say. She'd just done what felt right, what felt kind, but this man was looking at her like she'd performed some kind of miracle. David pulled out his wallet and Emma tensed, hating this part, hating the transactional nature of gratitude, but he didn't pull out cash. Instead, he pulled out a business card and set it on the counter. I own Hartford Industries. We manufacture medical devices, mobility aids, communication technology for people with disabilities. I'm always looking for people who actually understand what our customers need, who have genuine empathy and insight. He pushed the card toward her. If you ever want a job that pays better than this, that actually values your kindness and intelligence, call me. Emma stared at the card like it was a live snake. A job offer from a stranger, from a millionaire, from someone who existed in a completely different stratosphere from her world of burnt coffee and grease-stained uniforms. Her anxiety spiked so hard she felt dizzy. I don't have any qualifications, she managed to say. I dropped out of college. I can barely talk to people without having a panic at it. David smiled, and it was the saddest, most understanding smile Emma had ever seen. You communicated perfectly with my mother this morning, and she's one of the most important people in my world. That's qualification enough for me. Before Emma could respond, Margaret appeared beside David, tugging on his sleeve to get his attention. He turned and she immediately began signing, her hands moving with fluid grace, and David signed back with equal fluency. Emma watched the silent conversation, seeing expressions flicker across both faces, seeing Margaret glance at Emma several times with what looked like approval and determination. Finally, David turned back to Emma, and this time he was recital for real, not with sadness or relief, but with genuine warmth. My mother wants to know if you'd join us for breakfast. She's ordering more food and insists you sit with us. She says. He paused, his expression becoming tender. She says you remind her of herself when she was young before she learned to be brave about her deafness. Emma's first instinct was to refuse, to make up some excuse about needing to work, about having other tables, about anything that would let her escape this overwhelming situation. But she looked at Margaret, at the hope in the older woman's eyes, at the genuine invitation to be seen and valued, and something in Emma shifted. She found herself nodding. Jose could handle the few remaining tables, and the morning rush was over anyway. She slid into the booth across from David and Margaret, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the table. Margaret immediately reached over and squeezed Emma's hand, then picked up her phone to type. I told David about our conversation, about how you understand being different. He needs people like you in his company, people who see others clearly. Emma read the message and felt tears threatening again. She typed back, I'm scared. I've never done anything like real office work. I barely made it through high school presentations without fainting. David leaned forward, reading over his mother's shoulder, then typed his own message and showed it to both women. Fear is just proof you're about to do something important. I built a multi-million-dollar company, and I'm still scared every day. The difference is learning to move forward anyway. They spent the next hour talking through their phones, messages flying back and forth, creating a three-way conversation that felt more natural and honest than most spoken conversations Emma had ever had. David told them about his company, about how he'd started it specifically to help people like his mother after watching her struggle for years with inadequate communication tools and devices. Margaret shared stories about learning to navigate a hearing world, about the isolation and the small victories. Emma found herself opening up in ways she never had before, talking about her anxiety, her fears, her dreams that felt too big for someone like her. 3 days passed before Emma could bring herself to even look at David Hartford's business card. It sat in her uniform pocket during her shifts, a constant weight that felt both terrifying and full of promise. She went through the motions of her job, pouring coffee and taking orders, but her mind kept returning to that morning, to Margaret's kindness and David's offer and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was a different kind of life possible. On the third evening, after her shift ended and the diner was empty except for Jose cleaning the kitchen, Emma sat in her usual booth and pulled out the card. She stared at it until the letters blurred, her anxiety whispering all the familiar refrains. You'll fail. You're not qualified. They'll realize you're nobody special. You'll embarrass yourself. But underneath those voices was a newer, quieter voice that sounded like Margaret's typed words. Different isn't wrong. Emma pulled out her phone with shaking hands and typed a message to the number on the card before she could talk herself out of it. This is Emma from the diner. I would like to learn more about the job opportunity. I'm terrified, but I want to try. She hit send and immediately wanted to throw her phone across the diner. Instead, she sat there in the fading sunlight, watching the sky turn orange and pink, the same colors as that morning when everything had changed. Her phone buzzed less than 2 minutes later. Emma, this is David. I'm so glad you reached out. Can you come to my office tomorrow at 2 p.m.? I'll send a car. And please don't be terrified. You're going to be amazing at this. A car. He was sending a car. Emma felt like she was living in someone else's life, like she'd somehow stepped through a doorway into a story that wasn't meant for girls like her. But maybe that was the point. Maybe there was no such thing as girls like her and people like them. Maybe there were just people trying to find where they belonged. She typed back, I'll be there, and then sat in the empty diner for another 20 minutes, letting the reality sink in. Tomorrow her life might change completely. Tomorrow she might take the first step towards something bigger than burnt coffee and grease-stained uniforms. Or tomorrow she might fail spectacularly and have to retreat back to the safety of the familiar. Either way, she was going to show up and try, and that alone felt revolutionary. 6 months later, Emma Chen stood in the accessibility testing lab at Hartford Industries, demonstrating a new communication device to a focus group of deaf and hard-of-hearing users. She wore professional clothes now, though she'd chosen soft fabrics and comfortable shoes because some things about her hadn't changed. She still got anxious before presentations. She still sometimes felt like she didn't belong. But now she knew that those feelings didn't have to stop her from showing up. The device in her hands was something she'd helped design, working with the engineering team to create an interface that actually made sense for the people who would use it. Her experience communicating with Margaret that first morning had given her insights the engineers had never considered, and David had listened to every suggestion she made. He'd been right about her qualifications. Empathy and understanding were worth more than any degree. Margaret was sitting in the front row of the focus group, her face beaming with pride as she watched Emma explain the device's features. She attended every testing session, offering feedback and encouragement, and she'd become something like a second mother to Emma. They had lunch together twice a week, typing messages back and forth or sometimes using sign language, because Emma had enrolled in ASL classes the same week she started working at Hartford Industries. Learning to sign had been like learning to breathe in a new way, finding a language that felt natural and beautiful. David stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, watching Emma work with that same expression of admiration he'd worn in the diner that first morning. Something had grown between them over the past 6 months, something neither of them had expected. It had started with coffee meetings to discuss projects, evolved into dinners where they talked about everything except work, and gradually transformed into something that made Emma's heart race for entirely different reasons than anxiety. He'd been patient with her fears, understanding about her boundaries, and honest about his own struggles with the pressure of running a company while caring for a mother with declining health. They hadn't labeled what they were to each other yet, but Emma knew. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, in the way he celebrated her victories, and supported her through moments of doubt. After the focus group session ended, and the participants filed out, Margaret approached Emma and pulled her into a hug, then signed, "I'm proud of you." Emma signed back, "Thank you for seeing me," and Margaret touched her cheek with maternal affection. David walked over, and the three of them stood together in the lab, surrounded by devices designed to help people connect, to bridge gaps, to make the world more accessible. Emma thought about that morning in the diner, about the shy waitress who could barely speak to strangers, about the kind gesture that had somehow opened a door to an entirely different life. She hadn't stopped being anxious. She hadn't magically become a different person, but she'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward anyway, to reach out across divides, to offer kindness even when it felt risky. That morning she'd helped Margaret, because it was the right thing to do. She'd never imagined it would lead to a career she loved, a found family, and the beginning of something that felt like love, but that was the thing about kindness, about really seeing people and meeting them where they were. You never knew what doors might open, what connections might form, what life might be waiting on the other side of a single moment of compassion.